Hello everyone, let me talk about this. Trump really looks like Putin's little brother. Also, Ursula von der Leyen tried to please Trump by criticizing China, but Trump just ignored her, and she didn't even dare to put those comments into the official statement. With the shadow of the Iran-Israel conflict looming, the G7 summit held in Canada ended up becoming a stage for drama queens to put on a show. But unexpectedly, the most attention-grabbing one wasn't Trump, but rather the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. The EU is now trying to persuade the US to remove tariffs on the EU, and in order to curry favor with Trump, von der Leyen came up with a tactic of shifting the blame, trying to redirect the conflict towards China. At the G7 summit on June 16, von der Leyen spoke at the joint meeting. I read through her entire speech, and from start to finish, she portrayed China as a global economic threat, trying to win over the US to join in opposing China, in exchange for the US not imposing tariffs on the EU. She even brought a magnet as a prop, using it to kick off her speech, trying to reinforce her point with a visual effect. At the joint meeting, von der Leyen told a story to Trump while holding a magnet, saying that this was not just an ordinary magnet, but a rare earth permanent magnet. It was made by a Canadian company in Estonia, with raw materials sourced from Australia, and supported by the EU's Just Transition Fund. She boasted that this magnet came from the first rare earth magnet factory in the Western world. In the end, this magnet will be used in electric vehicles and wind turbines in Germany, France, and the United States. Von der Leyen used this magnet to tell a Western magnet story, and at the same time criticized China for dominating the global rare earth permanent magnet market. She said that China not only uses this near-monopoly position as a bargaining chip, but also weaponizes it to weaken competitors in key industries. She called on the G7 to unite in response to China. Von der Leyen's statement is clearly putting the cart before the horse, because after the US imposed high tariffs on the whole world, including China, on April 2 this year, China quickly responded by imposing export controls on key minerals like rare earths. The US slapped tariffs on countries around the world, including a 120% reciprocal tariff on the EU, which is what triggered reactions from all sides. But under von der Leyen's leadership, the EU has swallowed its pride and dared not take countermeasures against the US like China did. As for Trump, who was present, of course he hopes the US can achieve self-sufficiency in magnets. The problem is, it's not as easy as von der Leyen claims. What von der Leyen is selling to Trump is just a fairy tale. In the foreseeable future, the US won't be able to achieve self-sufficiency in magnets, and neither will the EU. How much production capacity does your magnet factory actually have, and what price are you selling your products at? In addition, von der Leyen also warned in her speech about the so-called new shock from China, saying that China is disrupting the global market by subsidizing its products, and that the G7 needs to closely monitor other key sectors that are most distorted, such as steel. Now the EU wants to set up a metals club again. Also, take the pharmaceutical industry as an example. Western countries are highly dependent on China for active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, and key starting materials, KSMs. Then von der Leyen shifted the topic to semiconductors, saying that it's necessary to impose export controls on the most advanced chips. But at the same time, the West needs to guard against developing a strategic dependence on China in the mid- and low-end chip sectors. Von der Leyen previously spoke out against China weaponizing critical raw materials, so how can she support the US in weaponizing advanced chips? It really sounds quite contradictory. The person who wrote von der Leyen's speech, honestly, their level of argument is pretty limited. Also, at the end of her speech, von der Leyen strongly promoted the idea of the G7 taking joint action, saying that responding together would increase the G7's influence. She said the best way to deal with China must be a plan jointly devised by the G7. To put it bluntly, what von der Leyen really wants is for Trump not to impose tariffs on the EU, and to get the US to join forces against China. However, even this tactic of shifting trouble eastward by von der Leyen isn't supported by the other G7 countries. As the European edition of the news network pointed out, the EU has been trying for months to persuade Trump to give up on the EU diplomatically. Besides, the EU's attitude towards China is quite contradictory. On one hand, they want to maintain trade relations with China, but on the other, they're trying to paint China as a common enemy of the US and the West. As the news network mentioned, even though von der Leyen's rhetoric towards China is tough, the G7 as a whole is being cautious. The draft statement doesn't directly name China, it just briefly mentions non-market policies in the critical minerals sector. As for Trump, it's as if he saw right through von der Leyen. He couldn't even be bothered to mention her suggestion for the US to openly join in on anti-China actions. What Trump is actually more interested in is supporting Russia. The G7 Leaders Summit ended on June 17th, but on the night of June 16th, Trump said he had to leave the summit early and return to the US because of the situation in the Middle East. Trump's early departure might be because the US simply wasn't interested in being part of the summit's joint statement. According to reports from the Associated Press and other media, there were quite a few disagreements between Trump and the other 7 leaders during the G7 summit, including over policies towards Russia and how to handle the rapidly deteriorating situation in the Middle East. Trump doesn't want to stir things up with Russia, nor does he want to stir things up with Israel. Trump doesn't care about being politically correct, he only cares about his own interests and those of the United States. At the G7 summit opening ceremony on June 16th, Trump said that it was a mistake for the West to exclude Russia from the Group of 8, or G8. He said that former US President Obama and former Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau made a huge mistake by kicking Russia out of the G8. If Russia were still in the group, there wouldn't be a war now. If Trump had been the US president 4 years ago, there wouldn't be a war now either. But in fact, it was Trudeau's predecessor, Canadian Prime Minister Harper, who kicked Russia out of the G8. But Trump still blamed Trudeau, which just shows how much he dislikes Trudeau. When a reporter asked Trump whether China should also be allowed to join the G7, Trump replied, "That's not a bad idea. If someone wants to let China join, I wouldn't oppose it." He added that what's important is that world leaders should have the chance to talk face-to-face at this summit. When von der Leyen wanted to openly join forces with the US to oppose China, Trump actually suggested letting Russia and China join the G7. Honestly, it all sounds pretty ironic. Trump has always had a big power diplomacy mindset, thinking that the world should be run by the US, China, and Russia. In his eyes, the EU simply doesn't count. So when it comes to peace talks on Ukraine, he deliberately excluded the EU and didn't let them participate. Because in Trump's eyes, European Commission President von der Leyen is a typical liberal, just like Biden. He really does find von der Leyen annoying whenever he sees her. But Trump, on the other hand, is especially friendly towards Putin. In May, the EU announced a new round of sanctions against Russia the 17th because Russia had no intention of ceasing fire. But Trump did the opposite. On June 16th, he said the US would temporarily hold off on imposing sanctions against Russia, hoping to reach a ceasefire agreement. On the same day, Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zakharova said that, at the request of the US, a new round of bilateral consultations, which were meant to address the irritants in the relationship that have prevented normal diplomatic activities between the two countries, had been cancelled. She said she hoped this pause wouldn't last too long. Although the US-Russia consultations have been temporarily cancelled, Trump still gave Putin a huge gift by suspending the sanctions. Trump's logic of suspending sanctions on Russia in hopes of reaching a ceasefire agreement is really hard to follow. There have always been rumors that, back in 2016, when Trump first ran for president, Putin gave him some help. Looking at how Trump acts towards Putin now, he seems like Putin's little brother. Does anyone actually think those rumors could be true? So, the EU wanted to pull the US in to put more pressure on Russia, but it totally backfired. Instead, the US lifted sanctions on Russia, easing the pressure on them. That means Russian oil can now be exported openly, which helps relieve Russia's economic pressure. The EU wanted to get the US to join in on being tough on China, but Trump isn't really interested. The US wants the EU to handle China on its own, and when it negotiates with other countries, it also pressures them to take a stance against China. But if China retaliates, then those countries will have to deal with the consequences themselves. The US stands to benefit if other countries take a tough stance against China, but as long as it doesn't get involved itself, it doesn't have to pay any price. Trump himself won't go against China, because it wasn't easy for him to secure a phone call with President Xi. Right now, he's still waiting for President Xi to invite him to visit China, so he won't just casually visit during his term, he wants to wait until he can do it with more prestige than Biden. If the US openly reduces its actions together with the EU to break away from China's supply chain, he's worried that China might turn hostile again, cut off the supply of rare earth magnets, or even cancel his planned visit to China. Actually, given the size of the EU's economy, it absolutely has the potential to impose counter-tariffs on the US just like China does, and force the US to make concessions. But the EU isn't united internally, and with surrenderists like von der Leyen, they end up getting intimidated by Trump, who threatens to slap a 50% tariff on the EU. Recently, there was a report that the EU is prepared to conditionally accept the US's unilateral imposition of a 10% tariff, which has sparked speculation in the market. Although the EU's chief spokesperson, Bolashajari, tried to calm things down by saying that media reports about the EU accepting a 10% US tariff are just speculation and don't reflect the current state of negotiations, the public still believes the EU will soon give in, while China dares to hit back with counter-tariffs to force the US to compromise. In conclusion, first, von der Leyen trying to pull Trump into openly opposing China is just a pointless and petty move. Second, Trump is only interested in making deals with China. Now that the US has secured rare earth magnets, why would he care about the EU's fate? Third, the EU is run by a bunch of politicians who only care about being politically correct. They basically committed suicide in the Russia-Ukraine war by cutting off Russian energy supplies. In the tariff war with the United States, China could have cooperated with China and taken a tough stance against the US, but it did not. Instead, China and the US quickly reached an agreement. Now, the EU is stuck between China and the US, basically unable to please either side. And honestly, why would Trump respect weaklings like Ursula von der Leyen?